Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on the Reassigned Number Database and Regulation F, everything you need to know. Regulation F outlines how debt collectors can communicate with individuals via electronic channels like text messaging, email, and direct drop voicemail, but it also outlines steps that collectors need to take to ensure the information they are using to try and get in touch with consumers is accurate and up to date. One of those tools is the Federal Communication Commission's Reassigned Number Database. Today in this webinar, which is being sponsored by TCN, we have a panel of leading legal, compliance, and technical experts with us to discuss the Reassigned Number Database, how to use it, and how it can help collectors effectively communicate with consumers. Before introducing the panel, I want to take a quick moment and talk about a new video series that I just released with the great legal minds from Batsford Remley. The videos are a resource that collection agencies can use to educate their creditor clients about Regulation F in the areas of the rule that are going to be most important to them. There are videos about the model validation notice, texting and emailing, credit reporting, and more. Best of all, the videos are branded with your logo and a video introduction that allows you to demonstrate your commitment to proactively educating your clients about Regulation F. You can learn more about the series by clicking on the link that I just put in the chat. Now, let me introduce you to today's panelists. Jesse Bird is a co-founder and chief technology officer of TCN, a leading provider of cloud-based call center technology for enterprise, contact centers, BPOs, and collection agencies worldwide. Since co-founding TCN, Jesse has played a vital role in establishing and developing what has now turned into a global software company. Jesse spearheads the software development, implementation, and execution of TCN's call center technology while leading the company's strategic direction and global expansion. As an industry trailblazer, Jesse continues to play a critical role in keeping TCN's call center platform at the forefront of the industry. Over the last several years, Jesse's taken an interest in call blocking, labeling, and stir shaking, and how these issues are getting resolved using software. With more than 2 decades of technology experience, Jesse has specialized in network and database design, cloud computing, process improvement, CRM, speech analytics, business intelligence, omnichannel tools, physical hardware, and virtualized computing environments. David Kaminsky is the chair of the financial services law practice at Carlson and Messer in Los Angeles. He represents debt collectors, banks, other creditors, and asset buyers in the defense of all claims brought under federal and state consumer protection and related statutes. He manages the nationwide litigation for numerous financial institutions and has helped shape the law affecting the rights of creditors and the accounts receivable management industry throughout the United States. David provides compliance and training advice and develops policies and procedures for the ARM industry. David was an ACA International Foundation Fellow Award recipient, the ACA International Attorney of the Year, the chair of the Attorneys Division of ACA International, and an award-winning attorney who has received accolades by numerous financial services trade organizations throughout the country. Bill Marone is the managing partner of the Connecticut creditors' rights firm Tobin and Marone. With more than 2 decades of experience in the creditors' rights and ARM industry, Bill represents credit unions, direct creditors, asset purchasers, medical providers, and collection agencies in all areas of creditors' rights law. He is currently president of the Connecticut Creditor Bar Association, is the current ACA International State Attorney Chair for Connecticut, is Connecticut Legislative Subcommittee Chair for the RMAI, and has served as Subcommittee Chair of Technology and Information for the American Bar Association Credit Union Committee. He's also a member of the NCBA Defense Bar and serves on committees for NCBA and RMAI, and somewhere in all of that practices law too, I'm sure. Our format today is going to be a panel discussion. We encourage everybody to submit questions, and we'll get to them during the course of our conversation. To submit a question, you can drop it into the chat or hit the Q&A button on your Zoom webinar control panel. I'll remind you, if you submit it through the Q&A, you can click the anonymous button and keep your name out of any questions you want to ask. Since some of our panel is going to be talking about compliance today, let me read the following disclaimer. This presentation is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area. It should never be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. All right, I got through all of that mumbo jumbo. Now we can actually get to what everyone is here for today, and that's to hear our panel talk about the Reassigned Number Database and Regulation F. So panel, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's talk about sort of what the Reassigned Number Database is and how it works. And David, we'll let you kick us off.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much, Mike Gibb. Uh, Thank you so much, TCN and Jesse and McKay. Greatly appreciative of the opportunity to speak. It's been a while since we have spoken together, so it's always great. William, welcome. So let's just talk about what the database is. And we're going to say this part tongue in cheek, but we're going to try to be looking at all of this with the glass half full, that this is going to be something that is helpful to industry, to creditors, to debt collectors, and all industry who make calls using and calls to cell phones. So let's talk about it. First of all, the reassigned number database is a centralized database. It is of reassigned numbers, and it's a tool to lower the number of calls that are placed to consumers by mistake. Also a tool allegedly to help industry to prevent potential TCPA liability if the database is used in the correct manner. Carriers have to report all of their numbers that have been reassigned and that are disconnected. And I believe that disconnection obligation started in, I believe, April of 2021, and I believe they have to report on the 15th of every month thereafter. So all of these numbers have to be reported. They have to be loaded into the database. And supposedly about 35 million or so US numbers are basically disconnected and become available for reassignment to new subscribers. This database is going to hopefully provide a safe harbor, almost like a bona fide error defense, but they call it a safe harbor from potential TCPA liability only if the database makes a mistake and if the database is used in the correct manner. So callers basically will have a safe harbor from liability under the TCPA if the number had been reassigned and the original number user of that number had provided consent to call. They have sort of a minimum aging period, and that I believe is 45 days after permanent disconnection of a number. Once a number is disconnected, meaning it is not in use, 45 days thereafter, that number can be reassigned to a new subscriber. And so that's sort of the period. And only a number's most recent date of permanent disconnection is the date that's going to be provided, right? So the database is only going to give you 3 possible responses. And that is a yes, or that is a no, or that there is a no data. A yes means that's bad news. That means it is permanently disconnected. No means that it's not, and no data just means that they don't have any data as to that particular number. For whatever reason, they will not explain. And again, starting April 15th, all the carriers and every 15th of the month thereafter have to provide and report permanent disconnections. Just in very short, how is it going to work? So you will basically have to have in your possession a last good date for each number that you want to contact, and you want to make sure that is within the reassigned number database, or you're going to scrub it against. So you can then send that date along with the phone number to be checked, and you can send that to the administrator of the database, determine whether the number has been permanently reassigned since the last good date that you called. So let's just say you called on January 1st, 2021, and that was the last good date. Okay, they're going to provide you with, from that point forward, if the number has been permanently disconnected. And if it has, they're going to give you a yes. And if you know that the number's been permanently disconnected and you know that you haven't called since January 1st and we're here in July, you can presume potentially that that number, that whatever it was, has been already reassigned to another person. So it's not going to tell you the person's name. Unfortunately, you cannot submit the person's name and say, hey, are they still the subscriber or the regular user of that phone? First of all, they could never tell you if it was the regular user, and they're not going to tell you if John Smith is the subscriber of that phone number. They're only going to talk about a permanent disconnection. And at one point it was disconnected. They're going to just tell you a yes. It's going to be a yes, no, or no data. I mean, that's sort of in simple how it works at high level.
Okay, thanks, David. Jesse, Bill, anything you want to add on top of that, just sort of at a high level about the reassigned number database before we start digging in?
The reason I was excited to be with David on the call was he answers all the questions before they even come in the chat. So I felt like his knowledge would cover my lack of knowledge in certain spaces. So I think he did a great job.
Way too generous, Bill.
He did a great job. You know, and not to get maybe ahead of script, but you know, the piece that he spoke about was both TCPA safe harbor and its sort of companion in the texting world under Regulation F. You know, so the tool, it'll be interesting. It's currently beta tested, and we may have subscribers on the call, and we'd love to hear your experience in the chat if there's anybody currently one of the beta testers.
Bill, could you just talk about that beta testing for a minute?
Sure. So as David said, going back to last April, and Jesse on the tech side, let me know if I'm misspeaking. But when they started requiring the service providers and the service providers agents to start tracking this data point of permanent disconnects, they were basically creating a seed of data so that they could run a beta test on the database. So the FCC, you know, provided an outside subscription provider who built the database and is now administering it on their behalf. And we're currently in the testing phase, right? I think it was July 1st to September 30th, if memory serves me, that that people that sought to subscribe would have an opportunity to sort of get a little bit of a sneak peek and a head start on how to implement it into your workflows and things of that nature. The interesting piece of the FCC's database is that it is described as complete and accurate. The actual requirements for safe harbor requires you to use and query a complete and accurate database, which this has been defined as, or one of similar, I guess, a similar subscription database that has the same level of information. When a regulator tells you that there's a provider that fits within the safe harbor, you may not want to go and litigate if your subscription database plan fits the true and complete database requirement. It just gives you a separate level of potential litigation and a new point you'd be litigating. So using what they tell you to use is probably the best business choice, at least early on in this process.
So Bill, are you saying that right now it's probably best and most safe to use the FCC's reassigned number database?
I think it's best for me doing defense to let you use another one, and feel free, I will test and litigate for 3 years whether or not your subscription was a true and complete database. But this one has been defined by the FCC as a true and complete one. So I would say prophylactically use it, because you know that definition will not be part of a litigation that you might be drawn into on the topic.
Well, to that point, the FCC selected these guys as the administrator. There's no other company that's been selected as the administrator. So if there's no other company selected as the administrator, you literally have no choice. It's kind of like the number portability database. You have no choice. You use the one that is there. That's it. So from a high level, the FCC, they mandated the creation of the R&D, and this is what we have. And this is the company that's going to support it. There will be a charge. It's not yet determined. You are correct that the beta started July 1st. TCN got involved in it right away. And we actually have working implementations of the reassigned number database and its usage in our software. They call it a true and complete database, and I would say it's not true or complete. I would say that there's probably still a lot of holes in terms of carriers getting their data into the system. They currently report roughly 100 million numbers in the database, and I think that's probably pretty far short of what you would actually need to say that it's true and complete. But nonetheless, the safe harbor is still there if it's used, and I think that it's going to be sort of a requirement to use it. the point that the FCC said when they were going to release this database is that they were going to try to mitigate unwanted and illegal robocalls. And I don't know if this will help mitigate illegal robocalls, because I don't think those guys care, but unwanted robocalls it may, because if you know that the number's been reassigned, you can do something more useful with your time rather than call again. And I think that I would only add one point, is that when you query the database, there's two options that you can query. You can query the date of your last contact. The other date that you can query is the date that you were granted consent. So if you've never contacted them, you query using the date that you were granted consent. And if you have contacted them, you query the date of your last known good contact. So your last right party contact.
McKay?
Yeah, that's probably all I would add on that.
Jesse, who's the administrator right now of the
The administrator right now, their website is reassigned.us, and the name of the company is Somos.gov. And I'm sure that was a company that was created for the sole purpose of winning this bid. And I don't know who their parent organization is.
Okay. There was a good question that came in. It says, look, what if the consumer changes carriers but keeps the telephone number? Will that be listed as a disconnect? And I say that it would not be, but
it would
Jesse,
be.
I'd like your...
It would be, because it's reassigned or disconnected, and carriers are all responsible for submitting their own data, right? And so they submit your T-Mobile, and they submit, and T-Mobile says they disconnected from me, this number disconnected from me. And then Verizon doesn't report that they connected on Verizon. Only T-Mobile has reported that they've disconnected. And I think that might be one of the problems, is from the way that I understand it in my testing, is it looks like that could end up being a little bit of an issue that somebody might end up playing games with.
I see. In other words, so a number is reassigned, or rather it is reassigned, right? Or someone changes carrier. So T-Mobile, from whom the number originally was, they report that number now as a disconnect. And of course, the new carrier, let's just say it's Verizon, is not going to be reporting anything, because that's not what they report. They're not going to say, hey, we got a new connection here, so the number is a connected number. So
that might be something that people clean up. Like, they may clean up porting versus disconnections, and I'm hoping that they get all that cleaned up before the beta period ends. But from my experience, sometimes it has been reported as a disconnect.
Got it. William, during this beta period, do the persons who are using it or being the guinea pigs in the beta period, do they get the benefit of the safe harbor, for using it, and if the beta testing or the system is in error?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because the system in error is sort of where the safe harbor comes into play. And so if you're an early adopter and one of the testers like Jesse, and Jesse, feel free to shut me down at any time, you do get the safe harbor protections. So you have a handful of business benefits for being in the beta, which is one, as Jesse says, he's already seeing where holes are, so you can provide feedback to the database administrator and do what they will with it. Two, though, you get to incorporate your workflows. And then three, you get the benefit of the future safe harbor during this window of time. So Jesse, am I right that they're going to shut down the beta September 30th and then go live with paid subscription November 1st, at least as the early plan or current plan?
That is the current plan. I have not heard how much it's going to cost, because there's a definite cost there, but they've not provided any information on the cost. What I understand currently on where they are with the cost is that they are negotiating what a reasonable profit means, right? So under the regulations, the administrator of the database is allowed to have a reasonable profit. And since they are the one that won the contract, they sort of have to work with the FCC to figure out what that reasonable profit is, because the FCC is sort of strong-arming everyone to participate. So that's why they don't get to charge whatever.
Isn't that cost going to be dependent in part about how many people actually sign up for this database?
I don't know. I don't know what a reasonable profit is gonna look like. I would assume that that will be one of the arguments if I was Somos Gov that I would use to say I should charge more is I have fixed costs that need to be met. And the FCC will say, well, regardless, everyone's going to use it. So just what is a reasonable per query charge? And I don't know what they're going to do. I think we'll see. In terms of what you're talking about in Safe Harbor, I think that there are some issues, as far as I understand it, in that Safe Harbor really only applies if you get a yes or no. But in my experience, the vast majority of the time you get no data. And since you get no data, you don't get a safe harbor for using the database at all, right? Because they don't have any data, which is a bummer. I'm hoping that changes a little bit because this has only reassigned or disconnected numbers. It doesn't have current connected numbers, right? So I've had my current cell phone for going on 20 years, a little longer than 20 years. It's never going to show up in this database because I'm never going to disconnect it. And so nobody will ever get safe harbor for calling me and using this database because they're never going to have anything in there. And so from what I understand, if you get a no data, you don't actually get safe harbor. And then, yeah, and that's, I don't know, that's probably, in my view, the biggest hole in the data. I mean, I heard you mention a little bit the criticisms that the reassigned number database doesn't tell you when it was reassigned or who it was reassigned to. That's probably a fair criticism, but I don't think that that's necessarily a requirement to serve the purpose. And I don't actually think that that information would be helpful for most agencies, because I'm sure that if you had the additional information, the regulators would require additional oversight and proactive action, so creating additional burden. So I think that the minimal data, yes, no, or no data is enough to do the job, but not really enough to require those additional actions. I think the biggest shortcoming is the amount of data which is actually not there. So the amount of times you get no data, which really doesn't help a ton.
And that's going to be the biggest problem, right, Jesse? That is the biggest problem with regard to the use of this database and its efficacy for, let's say, a company's intended purpose, right? If the majority of the numbers they're going to get hits on is no data, then it doesn't really benefit them, does it? Then you're in that no man's land. And I think that goes back to the question, and we're going to come into this later, but that goes into the question of compliance and thinking about your systems and getting compliance. From where did you get the telephone number in the first place? Did you get consent from the creditor to call the number? Is the creditor calling the number, right? Or is an agent on behalf of the creditor calling that number? Did they get that number from the creditor? And maybe that's potential consent under the FCC rule from 2008. But how robust is your consent with that number to be able to, call that number? So that's a big issue here. William, I'm going to pose a question to you, and if it's not for you, that's okay. We can throw it to Jesse because this is all new and untested. So if you get a number from a creditor client, right? But you just got that number, the creditor client sends it to you, hey, make a payment call on my behalf or something to that. Let's say it's first party or third party. And that number has never been used, right? But you believe that you have consent. Is there any information of any kind that you're going to get from the reassigned number database?
I think that you're going to have the same potential that Jesse's speaking of you're going to be kind of living in the world we currently live in without the safe harbor. Now, and maybe we back it up because we've jumped to the safe harbor, but not explained what the safe harbor is from. So if the number's been reassigned, what are we looking at? We are looking at a very high probability of a third-party disclosure. And so that is the space in which we're trying to get our safe harbor from and our safe harbor applies to. Under this fact pattern, we would have consent. We would sort of be living in the world we wake up and live in today, and we would be sort of moving forward. So at some point, you have to make a business choice. If you can track from your date of consent forward, and it's not enough information, are you comfortable saying that it has not been disconnected since the consent happened. In theory, under the FCC's order, they've been mining for and reporting this data point from April 27th or somewhere around there, 2020. And so if your consent came April 28th, 2020, as a business decision, are you comfortable that it has not subsequently been reported as disconnect or reassigned? And we are going to be okay to make that call. So it really is going to come into your risk aversion and potentially how you want to build out the model to comply with the sort of legacy phone numbers that may never, like Jesse says, the phone in my pocket's 20 years old too. There are certain numbers that will never hit the database. And so I would look to how I obtain my consent and then sort of reverse engineer where I am as far as comfort level on risk mitigation.
Yeah. I would say one thing that you might want to point out is, in theory, you live in the same world you live in now, but I think it may actually be different because of the existence of the database. I have some arguments that maybe it will be more difficult to say that I had reason to believe, and maybe it will be less difficult. I had reason to believe. There's arguments on both sides, and I think that is the area of contention is going to be when there's no data in the database. That's going to be for sure. And in theory, if there's no data in the database, it should be status quo, continue on as normal. In practice, there's going to be something different. I think that is going to be litigated to some extent. And I'm hoping that the existence of the database makes other reasonable steps you take along with the database look better, and so that you have a little bit more wiggle room, but it may go the other way. I just really have a hard time pinning that down.
And this is, Jesse, exactly what you're saying is one of the issues that I have. I'm concerned that, companies really, by using the reassigned number database, you have to be very careful how you're operationally using that database, because you may start using it and you all of a sudden may start restricting thousands or millions of numbers that are in your database from being called and putting yourself in a very difficult position. So I think you have to be very cognizant of that, and you have to be working with your IT, with your operations, and working with this database, because you don't all of a sudden want to implode your company and all of a sudden you're saying, I don't know which way to turn with this batch of numbers or these particular numbers, and therefore I'm not going to call them. And therefore you lose the opportunity to, let's say, get in contact with consumers, and then you start cutting off 50% of the consumers that you would normally call. I think that's a problem. So it has to be used very cautiously, judicially. You have to have a plan with this. This is not something to just willy-nilly use and say, okay, well, what do we do with it? What do we do with the information we got? So I think and this goes in line with Jesse. He doesn't know if, what I think Jesse was saying in part is, I don't know if companies are really going to get a benefit from this, or are we just better off where we are right now? I mean, look, we had obtained recently a great ruling by the Supreme Court, which redefined, or rather which clarified, what is the definition of an automatic telephone dialing system. And that comes into play here for TCPA liability for calling cell phones and texting. So you also have to factor in, are you using a prohibited auto dialer under the TCPA? That still is a factor that has to come into play here, and that needs to be thought through in any of your operational decisions when using this database.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was talking only particularly about the no data point. I think that companies will be better off when they get a yes, because they know that the number has been reassigned and they should not call it, at least since the date of last consent. You probably are also better off if you get a no, whether the number has not been reassigned. But you're going to be entering a new world of argument when you get a no data, because in theory, when you get a no data, and I think the vast majority of queries are going to return no data for a while, but when you get a no data, you don't know where you stand exactly. And in theory, you should stand no different than you are today. So if you have strong operational procedures, around getting, maintaining consent, because really this is the problem that they're trying to solve, is that they're trying to give you access to a database or the tools to track number reassignments or disconnects and solve the problem that is currently really difficult to know if the consumer you're actually calling is the consumer who gave you consent. So if you can know these things, then you're much better off. But there's going to be a huge set of data that you return and you're not going to have any data. And so I think they're probably going to look more strictly at how are you getting and managing consent overall when you have a no data in order. I mean, I think that that's going to end up becoming a pretty big argument. So I would say that everyone has to use the database, because if you're not using it, I can't see anything tipping your way. But if you are using it and getting no data, this is where I think a lot of these things are going to fall around.
I just want to jump in for a minute. Sorry, I hate to interrupt, but I wanted to just hit the pause button briefly on the discussion. I want to invite McKay Bird from TCN, the sponsor of today's webinar, to say a few words. McKay?
Thanks, Mike, David, William, and Jesse. I think this discussion obviously has, there's a lot to it, but just as introduction, my name is McKay Bird. I'm the marketing director here at TCN, and just a little bit of background about who and what we do. But TCN provides cost-effective call center solutions for collection agencies and as well as traditional contact centers, and as well as for thousands of businesses worldwide. TCN Operator, which is our flagship product, is a holistic cloud platform that puts everything in one place and allows for monitoring of your operations from anywhere. Operator is very highly customizable, and when you combine that with our no contract promise, it provides unlimited flexibility in being able to scale your business and your call center up or even down in those times. But I wanted to share with you guys also, we've put together a free Reg F guide, and it is somewhat of a cheat sheet on Regulation F, and we'll drop that download link in the comments. And so I'd invite you to be able to grab your free copy, and as well as to check out tcn.com for more information. And we'll also drop that link as well in the comments. So I appreciate it. And thanks, Mike.
Thanks again, McKay. And thanks to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. And I am just putting the link in the chat that you can get on the Reg F ebook that McKay mentioned. You click on the link and get that today. So I encourage everybody to do that. We've got a number of questions that have come in from the audience, so I want to take a few minutes and see if we can't knock some of these out. I think some of these we've addressed in maybe different sort of times in the conversation, but just to reiterate, is there any instructions on how a company can participate in the beta testing? Do they just go to the website and sign up? Jesse?
Yeah, so you go to reassigned.us, there's a form, there's an application, you fill it out, then they'll email you back, maybe ask you a few more clarifying questions, and then they'll give you access to the database. It's a pretty painless process, 1 or 2 days max. And then they'll give you access to the API and you can implement it, or they'll also give you access to a web UI where you can toy around with it from their web UI. Their web UI is pretty limited in that you can, I think, submit only 50 records at a time, but it will give you an idea of the type of data you get back.
Got it. Okay, thank you. There seems to be maybe a little bit of confusion on what the responses coming back from the reassigned database are when you query it. Is it yes, no, no data? Is it just yes or no? Does anyone sort of know for sure how the response, what information comes back when you put a number in?
Yes, no, no data. There are 3 options. So
Okay.
when you query the database with 2 options, with 2 parameters. You query it with a phone number and with a date. And the date, the phone number is the number you're calling, and the date is either the date of consent or the date of the last known right party contact, whichever is most recent. And then they return with yes, if the number has been reassigned or disconnected, no, if the number has not been reassigned or disconnected, or no data, meaning that the reassigned number database has never received information about that number. So if the number has been reassigned or disconnected and you call them, you will not receive any safe harbor at all because they told you it was reassigned or disconnected. So that would probably be a high risk move. If you get no, that means the number has not been reassigned or disconnected. And that is the place where the safe harbor may apply, depending on making sure that you use the database correctly and your consent is all in order and that sort of stuff. No data is basically the one where I think is going to be ambiguous, because you don't necessarily get the reassigned number database. You don't necessarily get the safe harbor for utilizing the reassigned number database, and you don't really know if it's a safe to call number or not. So that's going to be the one where I think a lot of the confusion is around, is a no data response. But in theory, you should be no different than you are now. So if you have your consent in order, you should be good to go.
And what I think, Mike, just to again touch on what Jesse's talking about, this is again coming back to the robust policies and procedures that you in the credit collection and other areas have had for years. You've had policies and procedures in developing consent and obtaining consent and getting consent from consumers. And you do that in a robust way. You have policies and procedures that document all of that, hopefully. And that is really the policies and procedures that you should still maintain. A lot of companies have asked, well, since the Facebook case came down and defined what is an automatic telephone dialing system, and we don't believe we're using an automatic telephone dialing system under the TCPA, therefore we can throw out all our policies and procedures and forget what we've done. No. First of all, there's still pre-recorded messages, but that's for a different discussion. But you still want these policies and procedures. You still want to have them. They can only help you when you are being challenged. And that dialer fight, as you have seen from the case law that has come down so far, is far from over as to what constitutes an automatic telephone dialing system, even under the new rule, the new interpretation by the Facebook case. So having robust policies and procedures cannot ever be replaced. You should maintain them. It's what you've been doing. You have it down to a science. Keep up that same work.
Okay. To the people who are asking questions sort of specific about TCN, I will forward those on to TCN and they will respond back to you offline when the webinar is over. So just know that you'll get an answer to that. Another question that came in, would the typical collection agency sign up for the database directly as part of their account waterfall process, or will this be something that telephony providers will provide to agencies as an added service?
So Jesse, if I'm not mistaken, the registration process allows for two classifications, caller and caller agent.
Yeah, that's right.
And so a caller agent would be somebody who's actually querying the database on behalf of a specific customer. And the way I understood the registration process, a caller agent can have as many, as many people in its family as it wants, but it has to have an individual application for each specific customer they're sharing the database with. Is that sort of the distinction between the two categories?
Yeah. So if you're a caller, you're querying the number on behalf of yourself or on behalf of or on behalf of calls that originate out of your system. TCN is still a little bit unsure if we'll have to register as a caller agent or a caller. We registered initially as a caller for our beta test period, and we've implemented that into our system through a few different ways. A caller agents still need to apply because they need to get their own client ID, and then they need to submit to the caller agent that's going to be doing the calls on their behalf a LOA, or letter of authorization, that's in allowing them to utilize their client ID. And then the reassigned number database folks have a process to add that client ID as one of the, or that customer ID as a customer ID that you are allowed to query on behalf of. So kind of a lot of steps to register as a caller or a caller agent. And that's something that we're still kind of evaluating a little bit, but I'm hoping that TCN will register just as a caller, to be honest. And that's all that's going to be required, but there's some debate both ways, I think. But we have, on TCN side, we have a bunch of tools for compliance and these sorts of things. And so even today, if you are a TCN customer, you can go in to your account via their list management services and start doing some test scrubs and see what it looks like against your database.
Mike, I want to talk about just a couple of things that and get Williams and Jesse's comments about a couple things that we still think are potentially problematic with the database. And there's going to be a question as to whether there's going to be any fix to that. So I just, well, first of all, we talked about the cost. We don't know if the cost is going to be prohibited. What is a subscription going to look like? We just hope that it's reasonable so that it allows and benefits all users to use it. So I don't know if there's going to be any determination of cost as opposed to in conjunction with the size of the company, but that's one of the things that have been bandied about. I know I had spoken with some certain people from the FCC, and they really didn't know how that cost was going to really lay out ultimately, but we're going to see in very, very short term that's going to be coming out as this as the database goes live in November of 2021. And that's what they say, it's going live, and we hopefully that they will keep to this with their word. I think they will. Certain entities had advocated to the FCC that they should eliminate any restrictions on how many numbers get checked, because that's a problem. You know, I think that right now there's there's a limitation of about 50 telephone numbers at a single time that can be checked. William and Jesse, is that your understanding?
And Jesse, you tell me where they are in the build out process. My understanding is ultimately there will sort of be 3 tiers, right? It would be sort of the 50 like that we're currently discussing. And then I think there would be like within the database, a file upload, and then an SFTP upload that would have a much larger scale of numbers. And I thought I read 250,000 for an upload within the database, and then a much larger number on top of that for an SFTP. So I was envisioning the pricing based on the tier, which would sort of equate to your volume levels. But my guess is as good as yours.
So I fully expect that the pricing is going to come out, and it's probably going to be coming out somewhere around 1/10 of a penny. That's what I would expect. And I think that they may also have an annual
of a penny, Jesse? Repeat.
Yeah, that's what I think. That's what I expect.
Okay.
And that would be for the lowest tier, and it should go down to some sub of that as you grow your volume. That's first. The second thing is on the UI, they have some interfaces. You are correct. You can either use the web form to copy paste numbers, and that one's limited to 50. You can upload a CSV that has a slightly higher limit, or an SFTP, and that's just in their web web interface. Their preferred for production environments is they'd like you to use their API. That's kind of what we gathered when we were talking with them. And they provide an API, and we've sent quite a bit of traffic through their API from the TCN system. So on the TCN system, and I think that this goes to something that maybe we should talk about, is how people implement this into their workflows. I think that there's probably going to be 2 places people want to make sure that it's implemented into their workflows. The first is you probably want to implement it into your workflows as a batch process, because I think that there could be value in getting these records scrubbed, because if you find that numbers have been reassigned since you last got consent, you may need to do something. You may need to do skip trace. You may need to send the number back to the creditor where you got it. You may need to do something else. And then the other one is you need to do a just-in-time scrub when you call. And so you need to make sure that you're able to scrub that just in time and make a proper decision as to what should be done with that record.
Okay.
So William, on the just from what Jesse is saying there, I just could envision a company's operational costs in managing all of this to be so much greater. I mean, you're querying the database, you're determining what to do with the numbers. You know, if there are certain batching restrictions, you know, you have operational burdens on human resources, you know, time sensitive calls, things of that nature. You know, can you give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it circles back to the point you brought up earlier, which is this is not wake up November 1st and start thinking about it.
Right.
This is going to require significant level of operational forethought. Just in this short webinar alone, Jesse's indicated a very big portion of your inventory that you're going to have to need to address. You're going to have to make a determination of how you're going to hit the no information files, and how you're going to develop your internal processes around those. But yeah, it's not, I mean, it won't be too dissimilar to other batch scrubbing services with how you would have to build out your paths from results. But the timing of it is critically important, right? So the safe harbor would require you basically to have within the last 60 days a verification hit that it hasn't been reassigned before from your last consent date or communication.
Yeah. And that's for text, correct?
I believe that's so. I didn't want to mislabel this. That's the regulation F, safe harbor on the texting side, right? Because there's sort of two pieces to this. It's the TCPA, but then also the regulation F, safe harbor on texting. And so, you know, you need to think through those pieces as far as how frequently you'll query your database. And David, you're absolutely right. Even at a tenth of a penny, running up your inventory every 60 days or short thereof is going to have an operational expenditure that you have to think of on top of the human capital, the management on the back end of it.
Yeah. So I think that the tenth of a penny is going to be where the entry point is. And I may be wrong. I've talked to some people that work at Reassigned US and some people that have worked with them. And no one will come out and say anything, but it's kind of the impression I've been getting. So that you should take with the biggest grain of salt you could possibly find. But that's my impression. And then the other thing in terms of operational costs, I mean, so yeah, there's going to be some operational costs, some ongoing costs in order to maintain your subscription to the database and utilize the database. But not to toot TCN's horn, if you have good technology partners, they should already be on top of this. And they should have access for you to start poking around with it already. And so if you use TCN, you can.
Another question, does the yes/no return values imply that the number has or has not been reassigned, as opposed to the number has been permanently disconnected?
No, it refers to, if you get a yes, it means that the number has been reassigned or disconnected. It doesn't differentiate.
Right.
And if you get a no, it means the number has not been reassigned or disconnected. It doesn't differentiate. And if you get no data, it means that the reassigned number database has no data. And you have to remember that is since the date that you provided when you queried the database. And that date should be either the date of your consent or the date of your last known right party contact, whichever is more recent. And William was talking about texting, which has a separate 60-day thing that may imply you needing to pass a more recent date, but that's the general of it.
To that end, there's another question. What if the number is received from your creditor client, but you've never used the number and don't have direct consent? What information would you use to bounce against the database?
Well, then, if you got the number from your creditor client, but you don't know if that's a valid number, what you're going to do is scrub that number for the first time against the database, and you're either going to get a yes, that it's either been reassigned or disconnected, or you're going to get a no, that it's not. But this depends on the robust quality of the consent that you were obtaining in the first place. If you're getting the number from a creditor client, and that comes from, let's say, an application or some other method of some other kind, and you can see that you're calling that number or you're obtaining that number within 60 days or so of that, then you may have to make a decision as to whether you can contact that number. You see, there's so many ramifications with this, and the use of this database, as we were saying, that you could wind up using this database, scaring the hell out of yourself, and therefore saying, I'm just not calling any of my numbers. And that's why this has to be so carefully thought out, is about what do you do with that information? How does your company operate? How do you obtain numbers in the first place? What is the quality of the proposed or purported consent that you believe you have in the first place? And that's really what has to inform your decisions going forward. And when I'm working with clients to prepare policies and procedures, We literally look at everything that a company does and we design it solely around what that company does, not in a vacuum, because especially with the use of a reassigned number database, the precision of those policies and procedures and what a company does and how it does it and how it may need to adjust that is more critical now than ever before.
Yeah. So the important thing to remember is you have to submit a date. So if you don't have a date to submit, you have to submit something. And I think if you submit a garbage date, I actually have tried to submit garbage dates during my testing as a beta tester. And I think that if I remember right, the earliest date that they allowed you to submit was January 1st, 2000. We tried to submit something like 1901 or something, and they said it wasn't a valid date. But so you do have to submit some date, and you have to remember that the data is valid since the date that you submitted, right? So if you get a no, it means, if you get a yes, but you submitted garbage date, say you submitted January 1st, 2000, you're going to get a yes if that number has ever been disconnected. And it may not have been disconnected since the creditor gained consent. So the quality of your data is really important. If I were to give a piece of rubber hits the road advice, I would say, if you get a yes, you should not call it. If you get a no or a no data, you should proceed as is and see how things start shaking out. Because the last thing you want to do is start scrubbing everything because you're frightened. So make sure that you have consent.
Danger, right, Jesse? That's the danger. You start scrubbing everything out because you're nervous because the database gave you a no, and that's the problem.
And I think it's going to be, the impact to your business may be more minor than you think if you just use it and just do the small things, as long as you are gaining your consent and doing the right things. Generally today, you're going to add one procedure and you're going to generally do the right things tomorrow, and it won't impact you a lot. But if you ignore it, it may impact you a lot.
And then to that end, you don't want to keep querying the database because every time you do, it's going to cost you money. So it's not like you want to put January 1st, 2000, January 2nd, 2000, January 3rd to try and determine the exact date that it was disconnected or reassigned.
No, that becomes an insane use of the database, Mike.
Leave it to me to find the extreme, David.
No, but you're absolutely right, Mike. You could see that people could go crazy with this, and that's what I think, that's why we're talking about what we're talking about. We're talking about using this in a smart and measured manner. And if you sit down with your ops people, your compliance people, et cetera, getting advice from your outside counsel, you will do this in a smart and measured way. And that's all about thinking about what you do. Look at, as I said, you have such robust policies and procedures right now. You have to see how those policies and procedures should be adjusted or tweaked if they need to be tweaked in light of your potential use of the reassigned number database. Not everybody's going to use it. Not everybody wants to use it. I've heard from others that, we're not going to use it for X reason, or we're going to use it in a very limited and smart and a measured manner. And that's smart. You have to determine what is the best use for you under the given circumstances. William, can I throw a question out to you?
Sure.
Okay, and this is from a user. I have my own opinion, but I'll let you answer it first. Someone is saying, well, look, the database is really no longer an issue for TCPA concerns because of the Facebook decision and its interpretation of what constitutes a prohibited dialer under the TCPA. And as many of you know, that the Facebook decision did come out and interpret what is a definition of an automatic telephone dialing system, and that applies to calls via an auto dialer, and that includes text via a potential auto dialer as well. So the person is saying, well, this is really now only about a third-party disclosure information, which is mitigated if you're not disclosing anything to the person who answers the phone until they authenticate that you've reached the correct party. And the person says, am I missing something? What are your thoughts about that?
So if I hear them right, it sounds like they're saying they're using an elephant gun to shoot a fly with the safe harbor that they're getting, right? Which is third-party disclosure to a reassigned number. Facially, fine, I agree. But let's aggregate that over all of your inventory, right? So if you are not tracking third-party complaints, right? RegF will draw you in if you're using the texting mechanism or to develop a texting campaign, because we've focused on calls. But a lot of what people are salivating over with RegF is, are we going to integrate a full texting platform? You know, and using the reassigned number database in that category is an important piece, because they specifically define what will give you an opportunity to not knowingly communicate to a potential third party. And so, yeah, on its face, you can handle these death by 1,000 paper cuts one at a time and hope that, you know, it wasn't a disclosure, or, you know, they can't frame a class because of Ramirez and we have to go through the individualized analysis. But David, you spend a lot of time, and Jesse, you and your company spend a lot of time building out platforms for the good guys in the industry, the people who are thoughtful and trying to work in the space in a way that is both consumer friendly, business friendly, and compliant. And so, you know, when you're given guardrails, use them. And so I understand the question, and I think in an individual business's context, it may absolutely be the right decision. I mean, we are talking safe harbors and potential business choices. You know, so it goes with your individual risk tolerance. You may only be facing a one-off claim that probably offsets the operational costs of implementing it. So I don't mean to be dismissive of the question, but, you know, you should at least analyze it and go through that sort of calculus internally and find out if it is or isn't for you.
Yep, I concur with that. I concur with that. It's going to be, look at, there is no one size fits all here. It's every single company is going to have to look at this and use it in a different manner and see what works for them and what does not work for them. Look, we've gotten some good law recently with the Facebook decision as to the determination of what is and what is not a dialer. And we believe that as more robust case law comes out and good and better decisions, that hopefully this will start to chip away even further, and hopefully at some point eviscerate the auto dialer challenge by the plaintiff's bar. But at least that has not happened yet. It's just in that nascent stages, and the plaintiff's bar has a theory that they believe that they can use to get around the dialer definition in its its naked form in the Facebook decision. They're using that footnote 7, which we won't talk about right now, as a sort of, well, potential workaround. And they're also fighting different issues on the dialer challenge. So hopefully that will, as the better case law comes out, hopefully that those will be less and less and less. And then that may pave the way to opening the doors for you to make more calls via your automated calling systems to cell phone numbers, without this great constant fear that you're going to be hit up with these individual and difficult, and then bet the farm class action cases.
Okay. We've got just about a minute left. What I want to do is go around the panel and give each of you a chance to share any parting words of wisdom, or what you think the most important takeaway is for people who are watching and sort of trying to wrap their heads around how this is going to work and what they need to be doing. So Bill, we'll start with you.
Well, you know, as always, Mike, thank you for putting together the panel and doing this. It's always fun to be on, and especially I'm always on with smarter people than me, so it's better. You know, if you're looking for a jumping off point, the database website has a bunch of the FAQs. It's got the registration process for beta. It's got the most up-to-date information as well as webinars. Start there. But the takeaway would be start. Think about it. Just like everything else with RegF, everything else with any new regulation coming in, find out how it impacts your business and make some choices around it. So that's kind of what I would walk away with.
Excellent. Thank you. David?
Yep. Look, you know, as Bill said, and as Jesse said, the beta testing is going on right now. There's no reason why you can't jump into the beta testing. It ends on September 30th. And look, this is going to give you sort of a window to the world to determine, you know, how you would use this in the first place. It's going to give you a head start and a jump in. So there's no reason not to take advantage of that, right? And it also gives you the opportunity to provide the FCC with robust feedback. So I think that's really important as well. It also may set usage expectations and somehow affects charges. So look, I think the reassigned number database, the way I'm going to look at it, and I am going to try to look at it as I do everything with the glass half full, because I think it's going to help in the end. I think it's going to assist callers in wrong number calls and potentially cut down on that TCPA risk, especially with class actions. And you just have to operationalize that scrub process properly and make proper use of that system. And this testing period, this initial testing period, is just a great way for callers to get started with the program and get a jump ahead of how this can work for your business, and you can make it a win-win for you.
Excellent. Thank you. Jesse, you get the last word today.
Super. Well, Shel Silverstein says, how do you eat a whale? One bite at a time and start at the tail. So I would say just start. Just take a look at it. There's a lot of resources out there. I've spent some time training every single one of the TCN account managers on what it is that we can and can't do. So if you have a TCN account, they can help. Otherwise, just get on the website, sign up, read. It's not nearly as intimidating as you may think it should be.
Or as we have made it sound to all of you.
Excellent. Well, Bill, Jesse, David, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. I really appreciate you taking your time to share your information with the audience. Thanks to everybody who watched and listened today. Appreciate your support and participation. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. Check them out at tcn.com and use the link in the chat to download the free Reg F ebook that they're offering. We're back tomorrow we got another webinar tomorrow talking about remote work and hybrid work and managing that. So we'd love to see you back for that. If you need a link to register, if you haven't done so already, it's on the events calendar at accountsrecovery.net. So we hope to see you back for that. Until then, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. We'll talk to everybody soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.